Thank you so much. It's an honor to be the last speaker of the day, but I am very conscious that I'm also the only person keeping you from your dinner, so I'll try to keep these remarks to a reasonable length. So as may have been mentioned earlier, this presentation is based on my book, Democracy and Political Ignorance, Why Smaller Government is Smarter, which is going to be out in a new and very exciting second edition within just a week or two. So hopefully you might be interested in reading up further on this subject. But the basic issue that the book addresses, and I'm going to talk about in my presentation, is this one, the problem of political choice. Here we have Willow the Golden Retriever. She is trying to choose between the Democrats and the Republicans, the two major American political parties, here symbolized by the animals, their traditional symbols, the donkey for the Democrats and the elephant for the Republicans. And the question is, does she have enough information to make a well-informed choice? And in the case of Willow, we actually don't need to worry too much. She knows a great deal about government and public policy, the candidates and their platforms, so she's in pretty good shape. Unfortunately, for most voters, most of the time, that simply isn't the case. So in this presentation, I'm going to start off by talking a little bit about why we should even care about this issue of political ignorance in the first place. Then I'll talk about the alarming extent of political ignorance today in the United States, but also to some extent in many other countries as well. Now, a lot of people think that if there's ignorance out there, it must be because the voters are stupid or because the information isn't available to them. I will instead suggest that most of the ignorance that we observe is actually perfectly rational behavior on the part of most voters in most elections. Some scholars say we don't really need to worry too much about political ignorance because even if the voters know very little, they can make up for the specific knowledge that they don't know by using information shortcuts, small bits of information that substitute for larger bodies of knowledge that they may be ignorant of. I will argue that these shortcuts, while sometimes useful, are not nearly enough to offset widespread political ignorance, and in some cases, they will actually make the situation worse. So lastly, in the final part of the presentation, I'll talk about how one way that we can ameliorate the problem of political ignorance is by making more of our decisions by voting with our feet and fewer at the ballot box. We can vote with our feet by deciding where to live based on the government policies there. We can also do so in the private sector by deciding what products we want to buy, what civil society organizations we want to join, and so on. But first things first, why should we even care about political ignorance? Some people, like the individual currently up on the screen, they say that if voters vote on the basis of ignorance, that's just their choice. It's an exercise of their individual freedom, just like, say, there might be some people who believe that it's a really healthy diet if they eat 10 cheeseburgers every day. They're wrong about that, most likely, but it's an exercise of their individual freedom. Perhaps we have no right to interfere with them or judge them. I think John Stuart Mill effectively refuted this argument with respect to voting because, as he pointed out, voting is not just an individual choice. Rather, it is the exercise of power over other people. When you vote for somebody and you vote and they take over the government, it's not just yourself or others that they voted for that candidate will rule over. It is the entire society. So unlike in the case with the cheeseburgers, where only the person who eats them will suffer, here, if you vote for somebody out of ignorance, potentially you are putting the entire society on a diet of very bad and harmful public policy. Moreover, in a democracy, public opinion has a tremendous influence on government policy. It's not the only thing that has an influence, but it does have a very substantial effect, so that if public opinion is ignorant, it will turn out to be the case that most of the time the government policy might be badly flawed, or at least much worse than it would be if the public were better informed. So for those reasons, we have good reason to be concerned about political ignorance and to recognize that it's not just a matter of paternalistic concern for the individual voter, it's rather a concern about the impact of this on society as a whole. And that raises the question of how much ignorance is there out there really? How bad is this problem? And it turns out that it is, in fact, extremely bad. There's a great deal of survey data which shows this. I go into it in the book. For now, I'll just give you a few examples. For instance, during the last U.S. election in 2014, the main issue that was going on was deciding control of the House of Representatives and the Senate, the U.S. Congress. Yet survey data showed that only 38% of Americans at the time of the election even knew which party controlled the House of Representatives or controlled the Senate at that time. Obviously, it's very difficult to hold the parties accountable for the performance of Congress if you don't even know which one is in control. Similarly, this problem extends not just over particular issues of this sort, but also over the deep structure of government policy. For example, for years on end, one of the biggest issues in American political debate is the future of the federal budget. How do we get out of the very serious fiscal problem that we have? Yet surveys consistently show that most voters have little or no idea of how the federal government spends it. A little bit more detail later in the presentation. Most voters have very little understanding often of which government officials are responsible for which issues, and that, of course, makes it hard to hold them accountable for their performance. It's also worth noting that ignorance has played a major role in the current American presidential election, even more so than before. While the exploitation of ignorance by political leaders is certainly not a new thing, Donald Trump, who is about to win the Republican nomination for presidency, he has been more successful at this than most other politicians in recent times. Almost all of the major themes of his campaign involve preying on the ignorance of the public. For example, the big thing that he has emphasized consistently from early on is restricting immigration, particularly immigration from Mexico. This despite the fact that net immigration to Mexico from the United States has actually been close to zero for the last 10 years. Most Americans simply don't know that. Similarly, he has repeatedly emphasized, including in one of his most famous early speeches, that Mexico on his account is sending us murderers and rapists who are increasing the crime rate. In fact, social science evidence consistently shows that immigrants, including immigrants from Mexico, actually have a significantly lower crime rate than native-born Americans, but about 50% of the public and over 70% of Republicans do not notice. They think that actually immigration is increasing crime, which makes them more receptive to Trump's campaign themes. His other big issue that he has repeatedly emphasized is the trade deficit that we have with particular countries. As he puts it, countries like Mexico and Japan and others are beating us and turning us into losers because they sell us more products than we sell to them. In reality, economists decry trade as a kind of zero-sum game between nations where if Mexico is getting ahead or Japan is, then that's bad for the United States and vice versa. And so he's preying on that form of ignorance as well, though I should emphasize that what he's doing is different only in degree from what other politicians do. For the most part, it is not different in kind. The strategy that Trump is using is certainly not unique to him, and it's been used by other politicians in similar ways for many decades. Now, at this point, it's fair to ask, is this perhaps a problem that's primarily about the United States? We're the ones who are having the issue with Trump and other kinds of political ignorance. So some people, particularly in Western Europe, say political ignorance is a big problem in the US, but in my country, our voters are much better informed. They would never go for somebody like Donald Trump, for instance. And it is actually not easy to do good international comparisons on political ignorance. There are some methodological difficulties. However, the evidence that we have strongly suggests that this is not a problem unique to the United States. Obviously, if you look in Western Europe and elsewhere, movements preying on much the same kind of ignorance as Trump have gained considerable electoral success in recent years. The National Front in France is a good example, the UKIP party in Britain. There are a number of others. Moreover, survey data from countries like England show that many of the same errors that are prevalent in America are common there as well. For instance, British voters, much like American ones, greatly underestimate the size of welfare state programs, but greatly overestimate the amount of spending on foreign aid, almost exactly the same result as in the US. And it's also the case that people in many countries overestimate the percentage of immigrants in the population and make many other kinds of errors as well. Recently, the British survey research firm Ipsos Mori has come out with a study of 33 different advanced democracies measuring the same kinds of indicators of political knowledge in each one, and pretty much all of them look pretty bad. There are some differences here and there, but the similarities outweigh them. So we don't yet have good enough data to say definitively these countries are relatively much better than others or vice versa, much worse, but it is very clear that this is a problem that goes beyond the US or any other particular country. For all of the nations for which we have data, it seems like political ignorance is a very serious problem. Moreover, it is not a problem. Government has gotten larger and more complicated than it was previously, so your same relatively low level of political knowledge has to cover more issues than in the past and is therefore even less adequate than it used to be. Moreover, it's striking that ignorance, or knowledge I should say, has stagnated despite the fact that education levels have risen enormously. The average American now has 2 to 3 years more formal education than their counterpart did around 1960. And it's also notable that the internet and other modern technologies have not increased average political knowledge levels very much, even though they've made it much easier to get information than ever before in human history. So at this point, you might say to yourself, if the voters are this ignorant, it must be because they're stupid, or alternatively, the information is somehow kept hidden from them. Nefarious corporate interests, or the media, or people in government have successfully conspired to cover up all the really useful political information, and therefore people are ignorant. If only the information were out there, then the public would learn the truth, and they would rise up and change things. I think if you look at the evidence, neither one of these explanations seems to be very valid. Far from being stupid, actually the data show that in both the US and in European countries and elsewhere, IQ scores have actually risen significantly over the last 50 years. So whatever else one can say about the millennial generation, it is very likely that to the extent we can measure intelligence, they are probably the most intelligent generation that we have ever had. Similarly, it's not very plausible to argue that the information is unavailable. To the contrary, basic political information today is much easier to find than at any time in the past, thanks to the internet, 24-hour cable TV news, and other technological innovations. So the problem is not that people are stupid or that information is unavailable. It's rather that most people are not using their very real intelligence to find and remember the information actually is readily available, at least in many cases. And it turns out that for most voters, most of the time, it's actually very rational for them to behave this way. Because consider if your only reason to learn about politics is to make a better decision in an election, the kind of decision that Willow the Golden Retriever was thinking about in my first slide, that turns out not to be much of an incentive at all, because the chance that your vote will make a difference to the outcome of an election is infinitesimally small. In an American presidential election, it's about 1 in 60 million. In an Australian national election, it's somewhat better because you have a much smaller population, but still, it's probably 1 in several million, the odds that your vote will be decisive in determining which party gets to form the government. So those are very poor odds. Now, obviously, most voters don't know these exact numbers, but they do have an intuitive sense that it just doesn't make much sense to spend a lot of time learning about political knowledge and finding political information. Your time might be better spent finding information that you can actually use, or watching reality TV, or doing something else that's a lot more fun than following politics is for most people. So economists call this phenomenon rational ignorance. It's actually rational for most voters to pay very little attention to politics. Now, of course, there are some people who learn about things even though they can't make a difference to outcomes. For example, these people, sports fans. These are actually Australian rules football fans. I made the slide specifically for the Australian version of this presentation, and clearly these people probably know much more about their sport than the average member of the general population. They know they probably can't make a difference to the outcome of games, but they enjoy learning about the sport. They find it interesting and fun to hang out with their fellow fans and have a sense of camaraderie. You can see these people, they're having a good time. So just like sports fans learn about sports for that reason, there are people who in the book I call political fans. They enjoy cheering for their favorite political team, conservatives or liberals, the Liberal Party or the Labor Party and so forth. They enjoy supporting their preferred ideology, and of course they enjoy hating the opposition, just like sports fans often enjoy hating the rival team and its fans. And I think there's nothing wrong with being a sports fan or with being a political fan. I'm some of both myself, but the problem is that when you're seeking out information for the purpose of enhancing your fan experience, like these people are, that objective is often inimical to the goal of getting at the truth. Think about how sports fans react to a call that goes against their team if the referee gives them a penalty or something. Usually if the call is at all close, they'll say, wow, that was a terrible call. The referee must have been blind. He must have been biased or bribed or something else nefarious is going on. Whereas if the call goes in favor of your team, well, of course that was the correct call. How could it possibly be otherwise? This is exactly the way that your most committed political fans, like the people up on the screen, react to new political information. They overvalue anything that supports their pre-existing views, and they dismiss or at least greatly undervalue anything that cuts against them. Indeed, the data shows that those most interested in politics, the most avid political fans, they tend to consume political information only from media that has the same view as they do. So if they're on the right, it's right-wing media. If they're on the left, it's left-wing media. And it's even the case that the most committed political fans tend only to discuss politics with other people who have the same viewpoint. So if you're a fan of a particular football team, you tend to hang out with other fans of the same team. Similarly, if you're a right-winger, you tend to hang out and discuss politics only with other right-wingers. And if you're a left-winger, with other left-wingers, and so forth. Now, from the standpoint of getting at the truth about political issues, this is highly illogical behavior. As John Stuart Mill famously pointed out, if you're a real truth seeker, what you want to do is make a special effort to find information sources that have viewpoints different from your own. They're the ones who are most likely to give you arguments and evidence that you haven't heard of before. But if your goal is not primarily to get at the truth, if it's instead to enhance your fan experience, to have your pre-existing views validated and reinforced, then this is actually entirely logical behavior. Indeed, economist Brian Kaplan calls this sort of thing rational irrationality. When your goal in seeking out information is something other than getting at the truth, it's actually rational to be highly biased in the information sources that you seek out, and also to be very biased in the way that you evaluate that information. So ultimately, we have a two-level problem of political ignorance here. Most of the public is simply rationally ignorant. They devote little or no time to learning about political information. There is a minority who are much more knowledgeable, the political fans, but most of them are highly biased in the way that they process the information. So though they know a lot, they don't use that information most of the time in a truth-seeking way. Despite this, many scholars argue we don't need to worry. Yes, the public may not know very much, but they can use information shortcuts to get around the problem. They can use small bits of information in order to do this. So, for example, they can use what scholars call the opinion leader shortcut. I might not know much about politics, but I can find somebody else who knows more than I do and use them as an opinion leader to guide my vote. For example, I can go to Willow the Golden Retriever. She knows much more about politics than I do. I can let her decide who I should vote for at the next election. Alternatively, I might not follow politics, but I know some things from my everyday life. For example, maybe I run a business, and maybe I know that business is going badly right now. Perhaps that means that there's something wrong with the economy more generally, and that in turn might mean that the political leaders in power in my country might be doing something wrong in their economic policy, so I can use that information from everyday life. The shortcut that has the most support in the academic literature is retrospective voting, symbolized by this famous quote by President Ronald Reagan from the 1980 election. He famously said, "If you want to decide who to vote for in this election, all you have to do is ask, are you better off than you were 4 years ago when the incumbent president was elected? If you were better off, then you can vote to re-elect the incumbent, and he will continue his good policies. If you're worse off," and Reagan, of course, knew that most people thought they were worse off, "then you should vote the bastards out. And then you can elect a different set of bastards to replace them, but the new set of bastards will have an incentive to make things better. Because if they don't, the same thing that happened to the last group might happen to them. They too will be voted out." So the argument here is that the public doesn't really need to know very much. They just need to re-elect the incumbents if things are going well, and then they need to vote them out if things are going badly. And over time, this will incentivize the government to produce good policies. Now, I think there's something to this argument and to other shortcut theories, but they're overblown. They're not nearly as effective as scholars think they are. One big problem is that in order to use the shortcuts effectively, you often need pre-existing knowledge that most of the voters don't have. In particular, to be a good retrospective voter, like Ronald Reagan wanted people to be, you need to know what issues out there the incumbents can affect and which ones they cannot. If you don't know this, then you will end up rewarding and punishing them for things that they did not cause. And indeed, this is what we actually do in most elections. Studies show that the main determinant of most elections around the world, the main thing that has an impact, is short-term economic trends. If the economy grew during the last year or so before the election, the incumbents will probably be reelected. If it shrank or was getting worse, they'll probably be defeated. This is so even though most economists will tell you that incumbents have very little control over short-term economic trends. They can often enact policies that have an important long-term effect on the economy, but short-term trends, not so much. Other events that incumbents have little control over also have a big impact. For example, there is evidence in the United States that in farm states, if there is a drought which reduces agricultural production, the governor and other elected officials are less likely to be reelected, even though obviously they didn't do anything to cause the drought. Similarly, in coastal communities, if there's a shark attack, if Jaws surfaces and takes a bite out of a swimmer, that's bad news for the local government. On the other hand, if the local sports team wins a championship, that's really good news for the mayor. He's more likely to be reelected, even though he probably didn't play in the games, didn't coach the team, didn't really have much effect. Nonetheless, people are in a good mood. They think things are going well. They give some credit to the incumbent political leaders, so this has an impact. On the other hand, voters often overlook things that the incumbents do have an effect on and therefore don't properly assess them. A second big problem with shortcut theories is that they implicitly assume that when people choose these information shortcuts, they do so on the basis of seeking out the truth. But in reality, often rational irrationality affects their choice of shortcuts. Consider the opinion leader's shortcut, for example. It might be very wise and effective to seek out opinion leaders who know more than you do, but if you really want to use this shortcut to get at the truth, you would want to seek out people who have an excellent track record of knowing a lot about public policy and of correctly predicting the consequences of past policies. In reality, however, the most popular opinion leaders, those who you see on talk shows or talking heads on TV, these people are clearly not the ones who know the most about policy. They're rather the ones who are the most entertaining and the best at reinforcing the pre-existing biases of their audiences, whether on the right or on the left. So it seems like people are choosing their opinion leaders less for truth-seeking and more for other kinds of purposes. More generally, the shortcuts assume that what people do is they accurately assess the state of at least a few facts about the world, and then they judge the political leaders by them. But often the reality is the reverse. For example, retrospective voting says what you want to do is see how things are going and then punish the incumbents for it if they're going badly, and decide how you feel about the incumbents based on what's actually going on. But often what you think about what's actually going on is determined by how you feel about the incumbent rather than the reverse. For example, when there is a Democratic president in the White House, Republican voters tend to overestimate the rate of inflation and unemployment. Democratic voters have the opposite kind of bias. If it's not your guy that's in the White House, that must mean that things are going badly. Now, of course, swing voters who don't have a strong commitment to either party, they don't have the sort of bias as much, but they also know the least to begin with about what is going on. So they're not a tremendously good solution to this sort of problem either. So I think shortcuts, while useful in some situations, nonetheless are problematic and sometimes actually make things worse. So at this point, we want to ask the question of what can we do about this? The most obvious solution is to try to increase political knowledge in some way, through education, for example. In the book, I discuss at great length why I think this is unlikely to happen, and I'm happy to talk about that in questions. But for now, I'd like to press on to something that I think can help the situation, which is making more of our decisions by voting with our feet and fewer by voting at the ballot box. Up here, you have a classic example of people voting with their feet. Immigrants arriving in the United States in the late 19th century. They see the Statue of Liberty in the distance. Obviously, there's a similar story about immigration to Australia and other countries. They realized there was greater freedom and opportunity here than in the places that they came from, and they acted accordingly. You can also vote with your feet within a federal system, deciding which state or local government to live under, or in the private sector, deciding what products you want to buy or what organizations you want to join, such as the AOS, for example. So is there any reason why we should believe that voting with your feet will be any better than voting at the ballot box from a standpoint of acquiring information and using it wisely? The answer is yes, there definitely is. If you're like most people, you probably spent more time acquiring information and figuring out how to use it the last time you bought a car or a TV set than the last time you decided who to vote for in any election. Now, is this because the issues dealt with by your TV set are more important or more complicated than those dealt with by the government of Australia? I think not. I think it's rather that you took the TV decision more seriously because you knew it would make a difference. The TV that you choose is going to be the one that actually shows up in your living room, whereas the candidate that you choose in an election, it's very unlikely that your choice will make a difference. Similarly, you also have a stronger incentive not just to acquire information, but to use it in a logical and unbiased way. Think about the following social norm that exists in the US, and I think to some extent also in this country. You're not supposed to argue about politics in mixed company. If you go to a party and you start explaining to the other people there why their political views are wrong, even if you have devastating and powerful arguments that refute whatever they happen to believe in, they probably won't thank you for correcting their mistakes. Believe me, I know from painful personal experience. On the other hand, if you offer them information that's useful to a foot voting decision, like buying a TV or deciding where to live, they will be more receptive because they know that that's information they can actually use, whereas challenges to their political views, that's mostly pain for very little gain. At best, you gain knowledge about a decision that's very unlikely to make a difference anyway. So what are the implications of this? I think one is that we should have greater political decentralization. If more power is devolved to the state or the local level, it's easier for people to vote with their feet because it's easier to move from one city to another or one state to another than to move between countries. We should also, of course, seek to increase the role of the private sector because there you can often vote with your feet without even physically moving at all. And there, too, you have better incentives to acquire information and use it wisely. I also argue in the book that this strengthens the case for using judicial review to limit the power of government, to empower people to make more decisions by voting with their feet, either in a federal system or in the private sector. And I can expand on those implications in greater detail in questions. Of course, I do so in the book as well. Now, obviously, I hasten to add, this doesn't provide a complete argument for libertarianism. There are other issues you want to take account of besides political ignorance. But if you believe that ignorance is a serious problem, then you will want to limit and decentralize government more than you would otherwise, even if you don't, as a result, become as libertarian as I might be. Finally, I'll leave you with this. Another possible alternative for dealing with the problem of political ignorance is retrieverocracy. When the electorate is mostly made up of golden retrievers, they are better informed and more logical than humans. But unless and until we can achieve that, I hope you will consider the possibility that political ignorance is a serious problem, one that can be mitigated by limiting and decentralizing the power of government. Thank you very much.
Hi, Andrew Cooper down from Brisbane. Presumably we have the same number of dumbasses in Australia as you do in America. In that context, what do you think of compulsory voting?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's something I discuss in the book. I believe it makes the problem worse than it would be otherwise, because data, not just from Australia, but around the world, strongly suggests that people who show up to the polls only because they're forced to avoid paying a fine, on average, they have less interest in politics and no less than those who show up voluntarily. I think compulsory voting makes the problem of political ignorance only moderately worse than it would be otherwise, because the people who show up voluntarily already have a pretty low level of political knowledge, but it does make things worse at the margin. So I think it's better not to have compulsory voting from this point of view, and of course, obviously, it's better not to have it just from the standpoint of protecting individual freedom. So I think compulsory voting is not the most important factor here. Obviously, Australia still has a relatively good government compared to most in the world, so I don't claim that compulsory voting totally destroys everything and leads to complete horror, but it does make things worse at the margin, and I think a good deal of social science evidence supports this. I cite some of it and summarize it in Chapter 7 of my book.
Professor, thanks for your talk. I think we like to think of democracy in the abstract, that everyone's voting perfectly informed and that the policies are produced, therefore good policies. But I think your revelation in your presentation today shows that, in fact, we're not perfectly informed and the policies aren't necessarily the best policies. So I suppose my question is this somewhat of a hammer blow to democracy in general? It seems that our politicians are getting elected for arbitrary reasons, nonsensical reasons, no more so than in other more tyrannical forms of government. So do you think there's still faith to be had in democracy? Do you think democracy is still the best system or the best of bad systems of government? Thank you.
I think it depends on what you're comparing it to. When I give this presentation or others like it, some people say, well, what about the fact that democracies still look much better than dictatorships and oligarchies on various indicators, economic development, freedom, equality for women, and so forth? I think that's true. On average, democracies are better than dictatorships, and there's a good reason for that. When I talked about retrospective voting, while it doesn't work very well for most issues, it does work well for avoiding things which are large and obvious problems caused by the government that even ignorant voters can easily understand. So, for instance, it's striking that in dictatorships it's pretty common for the government to engage in mass murder against its own citizens or to create mass famines. On the other hand, at least in modern times, no democracy, no matter how dysfunctional otherwise, has ever had a mass famine on its territory or, for the most part, committed mass murder against its own citizens. So in that respect, democracy is better than dictatorship, but I think we should aspire to more than merely just being better than dictatorship. While democracy relatively unlimited democracy is better than dictatorship. I think it's not nearly as good as democracy with greater decentralization and much tighter limits on government power. Looking toward the long-term future, I don't think we can rule out the possibility that over time there might be a system of government that's better than democracy of any kind. But for now, I'll merely limit myself to the point that while democracy is better than dictatorship, unlimited democracy is much worse than democracy with tighter constraints on power, and the problem of political ignorance is one of the reasons why that's so.
Hi, Ellie Bernstein here from Perth. Thanks very much for that, and especially about the model of retrivocracy, which I think is a very novel approach. The question I've got is, what's the role of social media in terms of political ignorance? Has it made it worse or better?
I'm not sure it's really done either, in that you might think it would make the problem better because social media makes a lot of information available to people, but the main constraint on information is less its supply side availability and more the willingness of people to spend time and effort following politics as opposed to doing other things. So social media does enable you to follow politics if you want to, but it also enables you to follow a lot of other things, sports, entertainment, your favorite rock stars or movie stars and so forth, or just your friends' cat pictures or whatnot. So what seems to happen is that the kinds of people who before the age of social media used to read the newspaper avidly or watch the 6 o'clock news every night, it's probably an institution that the younger people in the audience have not really heard of, but it used to be back in the dark ages that people would watch the 6 o'clock news every night at the same time. So the people who were generally interested in politics even before, they use social media to follow political issues. Other people use it for other kinds of purposes. So it's a great tool for those who are motivated to learn about politics, but it doesn't seem to have increased political knowledge overall. Some scholars believe that it's also had a negative effect in that with social media, it's easy or easier than before to sort of form a community of only the like-minded and to amplify your mutual sense of outrage. So if left-wing people are outraged at something the right has done or vice versa, in a self-reinforcing community on Twitter or Facebook, it's easier to amplify that outrage and be even more dismissive of the views of the other side than you might have been otherwise. You certainly see this phenomenon with Trump supporters on Twitter, but the problem is not unique to them. They're just a particularly extreme example of it.
Your colleague, Brian Kaplan, has a similar story in his Myth of the Rational Voter. How is this story different, and what do you add and he doesn't add? Secondly, isn't there somehow a form of inconsistency between the sort of I pay more attention to the TV decision because it matters more to me, and I don't pay attention to the voting because it doesn't influence me as much, when we know that people believe that the voting has an impact. Like they don't accept your premise that, oh, voting doesn't matter, I can't influence the outcome on the margin. They believe that they can, right? So does that make sense?
Yeah. So 2 good questions. I'll take the more general one first, and I'll talk about my specific differences from Brian Kaplan in the second part. So on the issue of what about the fact that people believe they make a difference with their vote, then why doesn't that lead them to find more political knowledge as well? I think it's true they believe they make a difference with their vote. The question is how much of a difference. And I think the intuition is, yes, your vote can make a difference, but it's only a relatively small difference, so it makes more sense to spend most of your time on other kinds of things. Most people don't carefully, precisely calculate it. They just have an intuition on this. In the book, I have a more formal model that it actually is rational to vote if you believe there's a significant difference between the 2 candidates, and if the cost of voting in terms of time and effort is relatively low. So people do vote. That's a relatively low-cost thing to do. On the other hand, spending more than a minimal amount of time learning political information is much more costly, not so much in terms of money necessarily, but in terms of time and effort. So it's easy for people to have an intuition that my vote makes a difference, I should make a little bit of an effort, but it doesn't make so much of a difference that it's worth the trouble for me to become well-informed about politics. So I think that's a reasonable intuition, and it's borne out by a lot of evidence about the way that people behave. I go into evidence in more detail in the book. Now, the second question is sort of about the academic originality of my book. Am I really doing anything that Bryan Caplan didn't do? Now, I'll start my defense by pointing out that Caplan has actually written a very generous endorsement of my book, so he at least thinks that I'm doing something useful, but I should probably give you a more substantive answer as opposed to just an appeal to the authority, even the authority of Bryan Caplan. So my book differs from his, I think, in two significant ways. One is that it covers a lot of issues that his book, The Myth of the Rational Voter, which, by the way, I highly recommend, he does not cover them. He doesn't cover information shortcuts. He doesn't cover federalism and decentralization of government. He doesn't cover also various ways in which the private sector might be better. He doesn't consider these institutional implications. That's not a weakness of his book. It's just a matter of his book has a slightly different focus from mine. I also disagree with Bryan somewhat about the logic of political ignorance. Bryan says actually that ignorance as such doesn't matter. He says if it was just a matter of rational ignorance by itself, without bias and irrationality, then the person who's rationally ignorant and knows he's ignorant, he will just simply say, well, I know I'm ignorant about these issues, so I won't have an opinion on them. I'm either not going to vote, or I'm only going to vote based on those few issues that I do know something about. So Bryan says if only people were logical in their evaluation of the information that they do know, even if it was very little information, most of our problems would be solved. I don't agree with that. As I discuss in greater length in the book, even if you're completely unbiased in your evaluation of information, and you know relatively little, you might still say, based on the information I do know, I think, for instance, the Democrats will be better than the Republicans on economic policy, or the Liberal Party versus the Labor Party, and so forth. And I recognize if I knew more, I might change my opinion, but it's not worth it for me to invest more time and effort to learn more, so I'll just vote based on my impression from the limited information that I currently have, and you could therefore make significant mistakes that way, even if you were being as unbiased as you could be evaluating the limited information that you do know. And in fact, we do this all the time in other spheres of our lives, where we know only a little bit, but we still hold opinions on various issues. In the book, I give the example of my thinking that Harrison Ford is the best American actor of his generation. I haven't watched all of Ford's movies. I haven't carefully studied all of his competitors. I know that if I did study this stuff more carefully, maybe I would change my mind, but it's not worth it for me to take the trouble to do so, and it's not that important for me to be right on this particular question, so I hold my opinion in a sort of provisional sense. So if the world was only one of rational ignorance and not rational irrationality, it would be a better world than we now have, because people on the issues that they're ignorant about, they would hold those opinions less firmly and with less confidence than they do now, but it would still be a much worse world than Bryan Caplan imagines it to be. And there's also a practical difference here, which is that on Bryan's theory, just increasing people's information may not actually improve things very much if they continue to be biased. I think increasing them information they know, even if they're biased in their evaluation, would make things at least somewhat better at the margin. So I can speak more about the theoretical differences between Caplan and myself. I think that's the biggest one in a nutshell, but the really big difference between my book and his for non-expert readers is simply that I cover a lot more issues than he does.
Thank you. My question over here. Sorry. My question is that in a direct democracy, some of those issues might have more potency, but in a representative democracy, isn't the main thing that people like us are in the legislature and that they deliberate and think about these issues with more length? And then my quick follow-on question was, what about sortition or other ways of getting people there besides elections?
Yeah, so those are two significant questions, both addressed in the book at some length. Let me talk about the first one, which is the issue of maybe we don't need to know much, we just need to select the right kinds of people to be in the legislature so that they know what they're doing and can make good decisions. The problem with this is that you need some pre-existing knowledge to be able to know what kinds of people will in fact make good decisions, what credentials they have. For example, do we want a supposedly successful businessman like Donald Trump, or do we want somebody with considerable knowledge and background in public policy or some other kind of person. Also, most voters do not, in fact, vote simply based on the personal characteristics of the candidate. Most voters do care about policy, and that has been repeatedly shown to be the case, so their policy views do make a difference. On the question of sortition, there's a large literature on this. I discuss it in some depth in the book. For now, I'll only say for those who don't know what sortition is, this is the idea that instead of having mass voting decide elections, maybe we can get a representative subset of the general population, a random selection, and have them make decisions, but give them more time and incentive to learn about the issues. I think this is an interesting idea, but it has various problems, one of which is that it will actually be very difficult for these people to learn about the full range of issues currently covered by the modern state. There's also a lot of opportunities for government to manipulate these sorts of sortition methods to make them biased and flawed in various ways. I see that my time is coming to an end. If you want to know more about sortition, or if you simply want to go to sleep while reading about sortition, read chapter 7 of my book, which has an extensive discussion of it. Thank you so much.